We have 4 distinguished speakers who will discuss some of these issues this evening. If I could ask them to come on stage. Vice President of the European Commission, Budget and Human Resources, Kristalina Georgieva. Thank you. We sit here. Please. Tobias Billström, Vice President of the EPP, First Deputy Speaker of the Reichstag, and former Minister for Migration and Asylum Policy. Welcome, Tobias. Commissioner Dimitris Avramopoulos, European Commissioner for Migration, Home Affairs and Citizenship. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Esteban González Pons, the Vice President of the EPP Group and the head of the EPP delegation in the European Parliament. Thank you for coming this evening. It's hard to say anything new and not repeat the same phrases over and over again. Europe is in crisis. Not just a crisis of migration, not just a crisis of refugees, but a crisis that speaks to the very essence of Europe, Europe's identity and of its leadership. We have an existential angst that even the depths of the Euro crisis could not reach, where principles are now having to meet pragmatism. The resolution you've tabled this evening, I think, attempts to reach that balance of how do we live up to our international responsibilities, but be pragmatic about what Europe can do. It's clear that the EU cannot host all of the world's refugees, but then who are we talking about and how many? What does equitable partnership between EU member states look like, between the EU and third countries, and what architecture for future policies at European level and at national level? Turning to my distinguished speakers this evening, I'd like to start with Commissioner Georgieva, because it's clear that regardless of the solutions adopted at European level, financial investments will be needed. And I am sure in the corridors of the Berlaymont you dodge your fellow commissioners as they ask you for more and more money, for more and more policies. So when we look at this, building capacity within national asylum systems, dealing with emergency situations at Europe's borders, directly supporting third countries and hosting an ever-increasing refugee population, and managing migration flows,
very important topic for all of us, out of respect for the quality of the speakers and the topic that we are touching today. Please, I ask you, if you have any conversations, to maintain them outside, not inside. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You are a gentleman. But turning back to Commissioner Georgieva. So what are the options now for the European Union and the EU member states to find the additional financial investments that we need? The EU is dug deep into the back of the sofa in terms of budgets. So what more can we do and where is it going to come from?
I mean, this is a huge crisis, and what it demands from us is to make it our overwhelming priority. In the Commission, this is what we have done. We have used what the European Parliament primarily, I see here Manfred Weber and other members of Parliament, have done for us for the current multi-year financial perspective. They gave us flexibility, and we are using this flexibility to the maximum. In a short period of time of 3 months, we have increased funding to deal with the refugee crisis this and next year from 4.5 billion euros to nearly 10 billion euros. And what this money can and must do: 2 things. 1, support operational action inside Europe. Help our countries with emergency measures so they can register refugees, they can separate refugees from illegal migrants, they can start return of those who actually are not running for their lives back to safe countries, and then also build the scheme of relocation, which for first time makes Europe acting as one. We have committed to 160,000 relocations. We are using 1.2 billion from the EU budget to underpin it. But equally important, too, to help the refugees where they are, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey. Help them with food and shelter, but also education for their children. Nothing helps a family to be more encouraged to stay where they are than seeing their kids being in a normal school environment, having hopes and dreams for the future. Now, you ask, okay, now for the immediate time, this year, next year, we came up with significant financial resource. What next? What is the second shoe to drop? And the second shoe to drop is integration of refugees in Europe. For that, we are already looking into our funding in cohesion, our funding in rural development, and we are talking to the European Investment Bank, how can we draw down to zero or even to minus interest rates for municipal funding so there can be housing and schooling and medical care and jobs also for our people. And of course, from the Commission, we lean forward. And what we want to see is that our member states are equally determined to come quickly and sustainably with money, because this crisis is not going to go, unfortunately, go away anytime soon. If anything, we are under the dual hammer of climate change and extremism. And this is unfortunately pushing up and up and up desperation, displacement in the world. So if we want to calm it down, we also have to invest in the long term in prevention, conflict resolution, helping fragile countries and communities to hopefully not fall apart.
So really investment in every part of the migration journey, from the country of origin and support there, right the way through integration in our towns and cities. But you have a unique perspective, because your former role as Commissioner responsible for humanitarian aid, you have a deep insight in how to get financial resources and support to particular crisis situations. So having spoken about money, is money enough to deal with some of these crises, or should we be thinking about other things that are not necessarily financial in nature that might be applied to help find solutions for this current refugee crisis?
Obviously, money is a necessity, and we Europeans are a powerful source for good. And we need to not forget that. And we need to retain this role in the world as a soft power. But beyond funding, it is absolutely crucial to engage geopolitically, to bring down the flares of conflict, and to not forget that we have to learn to live in an environment where there are multiple crises. We are not we Europeans, we people are very bad in coping with more than crises at one time. When I was Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, what I faced was Syria, Libya, Iraq. Now we can add to this Yemen. And then the belt of trouble from northern Nigeria, Boko Haram, Central African Republic, South Sudan, down to Somalia, then Mali and the Sahel. And that is so close to us. If we don't think of long-term investment in peace and security, using development to bring, hopefully, some of these countries to a more normal functioning, and if we don't, as Europeans, if we don't take a very strong stand on climate change, I think that we would be, unfortunately, facing a very difficult future. So as a humanitarian commissioner, I always would say this: pray for the best, prepare for the worst.
I think that's a good mantra for all of our lives, but you've also led me perfectly to turning to Vice President Billström, because as Commissioner Georgieva says, the nature of migration worldwide is changing. We are more mobile. As a population, there's high population growth in particular regions of the world which are less developed. We have proliferating instability, and we have climate change, the effects of which will be uncertain. And these are all factors that might lead to more rather than less movement to Europe, as well as more movement regionally. But you have a very specific experience, because last year you led the Swedish government as the chair of the Global Forum on Migration and Development to discuss many of these issues on a global level, with many of those countries experiencing that instability. So in your view, what would Europe need to change in its approach to be able to manage increased mobility in the future from the perspective of migration and development, from the perspective of foreign policy? And is Europe ready to make those changes?
Thank you very much, Liz. I would say that, well, this is the ultimate question, really. If I look back at my times in the Council, I served for 8 years in the Justice and Home Affairs Council as Minister of Migration for Sweden. I have to say that I was always struck by the different language being spoken in that particular council and the language being used in the Foreign Affairs Council, because they were very separate. And I think that this is part of the problem. We need to get a much more coherent, a much more European response to the issues which we are talking about. And we have to understand fully that there is a clear link between foreign policy and migration. Much of the things which we are talking about is not migration policy at all. It is foreign policy. And what we have to do is to sit down and look very clearly on our stakes. What about our neighborhood? What about the fact that we have countries in the neighborhood? Turkey is one example, another example is Saudi Arabia, another is Iran, and we have a whole of the North African coast from Egypt to Morocco, which is in our interest sphere. And migration will be forming a very important component in our relationship with this part of the world. We have to come up with some pretty good answers as to how that relationship is going to work out. You mentioned the Global Forum for Migration and Development. Well, much of that forum is about dialogue, and I think that dialogue is necessary. But I also think it's time for a political response. Part of this is about linking also migration to development and understanding that these countries, so close to us, if we don't match their needs, if we don't look at how we can mitigate the situation which they are in, well, then people will continue to come. And Turkey is key in this. Without Turkey, nothing can be done. And he or she who doesn't understand this doesn't understand anything about the complexity of the issue of migration and foreign policy.
Thank you. I think it's a very emphatic point you're making, and certainly one that's close to my heart, having worked on these issues for so many years. But turning domestically to Sweden, over the past few years, Sweden has managed what has been an extraordinary number of arrivals of asylum seekers, and done so with, I think, calm and an impressive level of generosity. There have been calls, including in the draft resolution that's been put on the table this evening, to bring temporary protection status out of abeyance, to start thinking about offering temporary protection to certain Syrian nationals and other nationals. Sweden made the decision early on to offer permanent residence to those people arriving from Syria, and I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what are the pros and cons of thinking about permanent residence versus temporary protection, because I can see that this is an issue that is only going to grow in importance over the next few years, particularly as Europe is facing a crossroads in deciding what the core goal of the European asylum system really is. And as the Swedish experience has been so extraordinary, if you could elaborate.
Yes, thank you. Well, there is definitely things which you have to tackle when you're a politician. One of them are the conflict of goals. And when we look at the question of temporary protection versus permanent protection or permanent residence permits, there is clearly a conflict of goals. However, I would like to underline the following. From our point of view, and I think I can speak for my party, the Moderate Party of Sweden, it is very important to have a holistic approach to this. We have to understand that we are part of the European Union, but our migration policy is also part of the European Union, and that we have to think very closely about harmonization when we speak about this. The fact that Sweden has used permanent residence permits in a larger extent than other countries of the European Union has played a part in this. However, at our Congress recently, last week in Karlstad, we made a decision that the party is now in favor of using temporary protection as the main line in migration policy. As we speak, the present red-green government, finding itself unable to cope with the situation, has turned to my party, and now negotiations between my party, the rest of the centre-right movement, and other parties as well, and the government. I think, however, that regardless of those negotiations, the way forward from a European perspective have to be more harmonization. We have to have rules and regulations in our 28 family of 28 member states, which are as similar as possible, which are implemented to full extent, and who are then followed up. by the Commission? This is my short answer. I could speak at length about this subject because it's also part of my experience as a minister, the fact that you can see so often that the member states have very different approaches. And I'm sure that the next speaker, Commissioner Avramopoulos, has a lot to say on that particular subject. Exactly.
Well, you guys are almost doing my job for me because you have led into my next question, and I will move over here. Commissioner Avramopoulos, you've been in the hot seat for the past year. EU immigration and asylum policy, and I speak as someone who has spent 10 years in Brussels, frustrated at the slow progress of policy. EU immigration and asylum policy has never moved so quickly. There have never been so many initiatives, and there's never been so much political will to do something, even if what we're doing right now doesn't seem still to be enough. It's clear that some governments, as Tobias said, and including, I think, your own home country, are really struggling to manage what has now become an overwhelming number of arrivals, frequently arriving in distressing and dangerous conditions, which compounds the challenge. It's not just numbers, it's about a humanitarian effort as well. And last week, one of the items discussed at the European Summit was the idea that's long been waiting in the wings, the idea of a European border guard, that part of this answer is to harmonize the way we manage our external borders in a protection-sensitive manner, and a future role for Frontex that's much more enhanced. Now, obviously, border management sits at the heart of national sovereignty. How might the future development of Frontex and the future development of a European border guard really develop, in your view, in your vision?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that I am really sitting on a hot seat. But in a paradoxal way, I like it. Although I can tell you that from the very beginning, I was asked by President Juncker to assume these functions. I had no idea about it. I'm quite experienced in foreign policy, maybe you know that, and I fully agree with your remarks before. But the Commission was not prepared to face such an unprecedented situation. From the very first moment, it was one of the very first tasks President Juncker had put. So in a period of 6 months, we adopted the Common European Agenda on Migration, which was a very important step forward. As from that moment, we proceed to the next step, which was the 10-point actions plan against smugglers, and now the relocation and resettlement scheme. But given my experience throughout these 11 months, I can tell you that at certain moments I was very much disappointed. I want to be frank today during this debate we have. From the fact that many member states did not realize how important it is also for them. We experienced a very difficult period for Europe. There's a trend towards renationalization, but as you said before, it should be confronted from the very first moment. It would be tackled in a more comprehensive way. So the very first objective, was to protect these desperate people who fled civil wars, persecution, in order to come over to Europe. So we had to distinguish from the very first moment who are the ones who are entitled to international protection and who are the ones who are irregular migrants. And we'll come back later to this issue. Yes, we had to protect and defend our borders. And this is the main endeavor of Frontex. But Frontex was very weak in the beginning. Now, during this period, with the support of the European Parliament, we have tripled the budget. We're talking about money, I'm always looking at you, and you know why. We have tripled its manpower and the assets. Now we have asked member states to provide us with more experts. We need approximately 700 people to be introduced in this effort. You mentioned the country that I know best, or the country that knows me best. Take it as you like. Well, yes, the situation there is a good paradigm of how Europe was not prepared. But also member states were not prepared. Everybody was caught by surprise in the beginning. Now we have the agenda, we have the policy, we have the will, we have the means. But what we need is the support of member states. Why do I say that? Tomorrow I'm flying to Slovenia. In this part of the world, and everybody in this room knows what Balkans historically mean, we go back to the old rivalries. There are frictions on the borders because some people in the area have not realized that we have to approach this issue in a European way. We must act and think in a European way. First of all, to protect these people, but on the other hand, to protect our borders. Frontex is enhanced. The fundamental question is, can member states continue bearing alone the responsibility of defending their borders? The answer is no. But also one more element. When we talk about protection of our borders, we must realize one thing, that we do not have in front of us enemies. It is very easy for all member states to deploy their armed forces, but it is not the solution. The armed forces can be helpful on other things, but not in order to show, to give the impression that we are threatened. We are not threatened by these people. But on the other hand, we must be very strict on the decisions we make and implement them. Return policy must be conducted in a very serious way. We have already started. The very first return operation is going to take place within the next days. And coming back to what I said before, relocation has also started working. In the beginning, to be frank with you, I was very much disappointed. But now I can say that we have moved forward. And Sweden gave a paradigm. Sweden is very sensitive on these issues, historically and traditionally. Now the other countries must follow. And everybody must open the doors for all these people who are in need of international protection. But the others, let's be frank and clear, they must be returned. And this is the main endeavor of Frontex, and that's why we have set up the hotspots in Italy and in Greece. Finally, they are operational. We are still in the beginning. It took 1 year for Europe to realize that we have to mobilize all our forces and to put at the service of our common cause, our infrastructures and our systems. So the answer is clear. Yes, we defend our borders, we protect these people, and finally, we have to go by the rules. There are no rules. And you know, some people know that, especially the smugglers. Recently, I was in Lampedusa, and I met many of those people. They had been given instructions. Don't be fingerprinted. Don't be registered. Don't be identified. Otherwise, you will be sent back. So we had an open dialogue with the presidency. It was Asselborn at the time. With them, telling them, trust us. You are on the European soil, in the most civilized part of the world as far as democratic values are concerned. So trust us. But in order for us to trust you, you have to go according to the rules of this continent, of this union, under these states. It took a lot of time, but now I believe we're on the good track, and I'm optimistic for the future, although I believe, I come back to the previous remarks, that the solution has to be political, because it is a political issue. It is also a foreign relations issue, because as long as this part of the Europe, of Mediterranean, is on fire, I'm not very optimistic. We have to do whatever we can in order to bring back stability in Eastern Mediterranean, because one of the root causes is not poverty, as some people believe. Yes, irregular migrants come over the Sahel area because of that, but the others, they flee their countries because their countries are on fire. And you know, in Europe, we must not forget that. We are citizens of nations of migrants. We have sent our citizens all around the world, in America, in Australia, in Canada. But on the other hand, we have lived this refugees problem within Europe, especially during the Second World War and before. So it is in our DNA to understand the situation and take all the necessary measures. But the Commission has done its part. Now it is up to Member States to take a share of their part and do their duty. We gave the lines, we gave the policy, and I am grateful, first of all, to the European Parliament, because from the very first moment we were very supportive to our cause. But the Council, sorry to say that, I'm outspoken today, has a huge responsibility. The day after tomorrow, we're going, President Juncker has convened a mini summit in Brussels. The Balkans roots leaders will be there, from Greece to Germany. I hope around the table they will have a frank discussion in the spirit we are talking tonight here.
So discussing collaboration and talking about return, which I think is an extremely important part of this entire mechanism. There are lots of moving parts, and return is one of them. And historically, Europe has talked a good game, but not necessarily lived up to those promises on return. Some countries are better than others, and they critically rely on bilateral relations with third countries as well. The EU's expended enormous amounts of political capital and time and energy negotiating EU readmission agreements. They don't always get used. So what is it that the European Union itself, the European Commission, can do to help EU member states, particularly those EU member states that haven't really got the capacity for return, to really scale up?
Absolutely. First of all, the Commission is here. We have sent a message all around Europe that member states who need our help, we are there to help them, to provide them with the necessary means, the tools, the policy, and the money. It is up to the member states to request. We cannot just go to a capital city and say, here we are, we give you what you didn't ask for. It is very important what I tell you, because many member states, they have not requested our help, although they are in need. So the European Union and the institutions and the Commission, as I said in the beginning, have responded positively to that. Let me add one more element. Here is the EPP Congress, and we know that our party is basing its existence on values, on the same values upon Europe is built. We have to defend these values. We have to protect these values. We have to inspire the European citizens to follow this policy. Because I do not accept other political parties to monopolize social and human sensitivity. We are the People's Party. We are much closer to the people. And we do not distinguish people according to their race, to their religion, or to their ethnic origin. So it is also a political message, I believe, should be sent from this meeting here in Madrid, that we are the ones who defend and protect the values upon which Europe is built.
I think that's a very important point. And it also speaks back to what Commissioner Georgieva was saying about Europe's leadership role in the world and setting an example, and I think that's core to it. So, turning to our final distinguished panelist, we're here in Spain, and 10 years ago, some of the headlines we heard in Spain were not so different from the ones we hear in Greece and in the Western Balkans now. Large numbers of people who were arriving either at the external borders in North Africa, as Ceuta and Melilla, either arriving by sea in the Canary Islands, and yet to evidence of that chaos that we are seeing elsewhere across the European Union. What was it that the Spanish government did, really, to address some of these challenges? And are there lessons for other governments in the EU at this critical moment?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say that I think that Mr. Avramopoulos is right when he says that the Commission is doing its job and that we are waiting now the Member States for do their part, because I think that the European Commission has done a big effort attending to this problem, and now it's the turn of the Member States, and that it now is the Council who has to do its part. Talking about Spain, I must say that Spain is the only UA country that has a land border in Africa. Our proximity to the African continent has made us the perfect entry point, as you said, of various routes of illegal migrants. Due to this circumstance, Spain has been facing the problem of irregular migration for several years, but our work has proved to be successful. I must say that in 2006, almost 40,000 irregular migrants reached our coast. In 2014, there were only 4,500. In this challenging path, we have always assumed our responsibility as a state with EU external borders. So that means that we made the decisions for the benefit of the member states. Spain's migration policy is based in 4 axes. First, prevention in origin, cooperation with countries of origin and transit, fighting against criminal network of trafficking and adopting concrete measures, and improving border management. Regarding asylum and international protection, my country has also worked very hard. This year, we have opened 2 international protection offices in Ceuta and Melilla to address the increasing number of petitions. So based in the Spanish experience, the European policy must include, of course, immigratory actions in the UA territory, but also a huge effort in development policies in the countries of origin. Our European strategy has to be well structured in future terms and with the appropriate funding. I must repeat this, with the appropriate funding. Defending the Spanish border is defending the European border. We are going to be responsible with our due. We are going to be responsible defending, protecting the European border, but we ask the rest of the countries to have solidarity with Spain. We have to change. We are waiting the answer of solidarity when we work in a very responsible form, protecting the European borders, the Spanish borders.
Thank you. And one particular element of your strategy from 10 years ago was really how you built relationships with countries in North and West Africa, and not just relationships based on financial incentives, but relationships built on the mutual interests in all those countries. And I know Spain has been active in developing Morocco's own asylum system after requests from the government there. What can you tell me, and what might the upcoming Valletta conference, which will be between EU heads of state and AU heads of state, really learn from that experience of managing a dialogue with third countries?
We have discussed this for a long time, and at the end, let me say that we have to tackle first that the UA has to improve the control of the external borders. That's very clear. The UA has to fight against the people who traffic with humans, with the human traffickers. The UA has to apply the asylum procedure. The UA have to make the return policy an effective policy. And last but not least, we have to reach a real migration common policy. Let me say, for finishing, words in some sentence in Spanish. España es el único país de la Unión Europea que tiene frontera en África. Precisamente por eso, España lleva ya muchos años enfrentándose al problema de la inmigración ilegal. Debo decir que para nosotros proteger la frontera de España siempre ha sido proteger una frontera de la Unión Europea, que lo hemos hecho con responsabilidad y que por eso hemos pedido solidaridad. Solidaridad a cambio de nuestra responsabilidad. Nosotros protegemos la frontera de la Unión Europea en África y lo que pedimos es solidaridad al resto de países con los españoles que estamos en la frontera de la Unión Europea. Antes de Siria ya había refugiados. Después de Siria habrá refugiados. Antes de la guerra había refugiados. Después de la guerra habrá refugiados. Los refugiados no son el problema, son las víctimas del problema. Los refugiados no son el peligro, los refugiados huyen del peligro. No se acaba con la inmigración poniéndoselo difícil a los inmigrantes, se acaba con la inmigración acabando con las razones por las que personas que no querían irse de su casa tienen que marcharse de su casa. La inmigración no es el problema es la guerra, el problema es el hambre, el problema es el cambio climático, el problema es la pobreza. Por lo tanto, la inmigración no es la solución. La solución es acabar con la guerra, es luchar contra el cambio climático, es luchar contra la enfermedad, es luchar contra la pobreza. La buena noticia es que está todavía en nuestras manos, que ahora podemos hacerlo. La mala noticia es que si dejamos pasar el tiempo, el problema no tendrá solución. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to give each of our speakers, we have a little couple of minutes. I'd like to give each of our speakers the right to intervene. And if you don't have anything burning to say, I will ask you to answer the following question. If you had a magic wand and you ruled the European Council for a day, what one policy would you put in place first? If I can go to Commissioner Avramopoulos first.
I will be very short. It was very correctly mentioned before that we must engage third countries, African countries, Middle East countries. So the Valletta meeting, the Valletta summit that will take place in 1 month from now in Valletta, Malta, will gather around the table the leadership of the European Union, but also the leadership of Northern African countries and Middle East. For the very first time, third countries will be there to discuss this issue openly and frankly. And this time it will not be one more debate, one more summit. It will be very concrete to the substance of the cause. And I'm sure our President, Mr. Juncker, who is here with us tonight, we're going to present a full proposal on behalf of the European Union to all these countries. Also, we mentioned before Turkey. I fully agree with you. We must put Turkey on board. Turkey is a strategic key player in the region. And recently, the meeting between the President and President Erdogan was very successful. We opened a dialogue. We proceed to the adoption of an action plan that gives answers to all these problems that have occurred during this period. Because Turkey today is hosting 2 million people, more than 2 million people, refugees, undocumented people are in the country, but it's also a corridor towards Europe through Greece. So Turkey is also on board.
So your magic wand would be in that direction.
And last but not least, from the very moment of the life of this Commission, we have put on the table a proposal for legal migration. During the first 6 months of the next year, this proposal will be put in a dialogue, in debate with the European Parliament. So finally, after decades, Europe will have its own migration policy, because Europe will need migrants. Europe is an aging continent. In some decades from now, we shall need workforce, skilled people. We need them. So we work on that, and very soon the Commission will take again the lead to respond to all these questions.
Thank you very much, and you've raised a very important point, which is the legal side of migration, apart from the enforcement side. Vice President Billström, where would your magic wand go, or your top priority?
Thank you. Yes, magical wands are often very dangerous things, and I think that what we really need to understand is that there is no such thing as an easy or a quick solution. It is not the wave of a one which is going to make things happen. I completely agree with Commissioner Avramopoulos that Valletta summit is an important first step, but it is the first step. It will have to be followed up by a much more comprehensive and deep-running dialogue with our potential partners in Africa, because otherwise we will just be stuck on the same spot. I also would like to underline that I mentioned Turkey, and Turkey is key, but there is also another country very close to the European Union for which we have to keep our eyes very, very fixed, and that is Ukraine. Because Ukraine holds a very large number of IDPs, internally displaced persons, thanks to the conflict. Now, if we don't manage to balance Ukraine, the Ukrainian economy, and finally the Ukrainian state, there is a great risk that those people will also be on the move towards the West, towards the European Union. And some states represented here tonight in this assembly will be very gravely affected. Poland, first of all, because of its close links with Ukraine, but also other countries, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, etc. So we have to keep a close eye on our entire neighborhood, not just to the south, but also to the east. And finally, there is a need for well-managed migration. We need border controls. We need to see to it that our borders are controlled in a way that means that we make it more difficult for people to enter our union if they follow the leads of the smugglers. But we also need to have alternative routes for people who want to come to the union for right reasons. And we mustn't forget this either. I think that we need to have a much more holistic and much more comprehensive answer, a truly European answer, and that has to be the answer that EPP has to give as a political family.
We agree.
That's also the answer for a perfect answer for a think tank director to hear. Complex issues and complex solutions. Vice President González Pons, your top priority, the thing we must do.
Well, you are asking for a magic solution. And
it's a false premise, I understand.
It's a magic solution and a short answer. So I think that there is only one solution that I can include, that can be included in a short answer, what is stop the war. If I could do something, just one thing, for a moment, I'm sure that it should be to stop the war. I have to say again and again, I have to say it again and again, the problem are not the refugees. The problem are not the migrants. The problem is hunger, the problem is war. And what we have to do is to stop the war forever.
Thank you. Extraordinarily important point.
So my turn.
Vice President Georgieva, last but certainly not least, give us your final words.
If I were to have a magic wand, I would wave it and turn our crisis pyramid around. Invest in prevention, address the root causes as to why people run, rather than spend billions and billions and billions to deal with the consequences. €1 invested in prevention, 7, 10, 20 saved. And on top of it, of course, tons of human suffering. So I would like to see us being able to anticipate crises, act early, help the most vulnerable at home and abroad. And then we would have a better world. But can I finish with a joke?
Please do.
Great.
After the
So here is my joke. How can we deal with the problems we discussed tonight? There are two ways. One is realistic, the other one is fantastic. The realistic is extraterrestrials come from space, take over human affairs, and get it done. And the fantastic is we humans act early, prevent the tragedies, and we do it ourselves. So my wish for this Congress, that we make the fantastic realistic, because we are EPP. We can do it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for setting what is an enormous challenge out to the audience, and I hope you can live up to it. I would like to thank the four panelists, not just for their extremely thoughtful interventions, but for really giving us a lot of meat to chew over. And we haven't even, I think, covered half the topic.